Hello everyone and welcome back to Biology 206. Today we're going to be talking about a number of things which we'll get into in a moment, but I wanted to first of all flag a few logistical tidbits. The first of these is that our first Meet the Scientist is happening this Thursday, and we are lucky to have Dr. Jessie Popp presenting her research on weaving ecology and traditional ecological knowledge. Unfortunately, Dr. Popp will not be able to join us synchronously this week, and so on Thursday, or embedded in today's lecture, is a link to a lecture that Dr. Popp recorded last year that is on this topic and will serve as our first Meet the Scientist. Assuming all goes well with the rest of the term, we'll have the rest of our Meet the Scientist visitors joining us in person. Okay. Second point that I wanted to flag is that we'll have our first in-person or synchronous lecture this Thursday. I will be popping a Zoom link into our course website today. And so this will be a bit of a meet and greet so that we can meet one another, see one another's faces, etc. But also that you can ask any questions you have about the syllabus, about the way the course is going to run, about any concerns you have for the coming term, and we can discuss some of those things, or discuss any of the content that was from the first introductory lecture or this lecture that we're about to go through. So that is Thursday, January 6th in our usual class time, so 5:30 to 7. And again, I will post a Zoom link in my learning space. Finally, we won't have student hours today, given that today is the first day of classes. Student hours will start next Tuesday, January 11th. I will put a recurring Zoom link into our course website on my learning space, and you can access that there. As I mentioned in the previous lecture, the student hours are drop-in, so I will have my Zoom link open for from 4 o'clock to 5 o'clock on Tuesdays, and you're welcome to pop in as you have time. If that time slot doesn't work for you, then please feel free to reach out and set up an appointment. Okay. So with that, we'll get right into it. And we have a few learning objectives today. First of all is to get a feel for, why are you here? Why is this course relevant to you, to biology? This is a core course in biology, and why is it important that you take this? Second, what is ecology? We'll go through that. We'll talk about the links between traditional knowledge, traditional ecological knowledge, and ecology, and this blends itself into Dr. Popp's lecture that will be embedded in this lecture, and you can watch it anytime over the next few days. We'll talk about the scientific method and how ecologists use this, and then we'll talk about scale in ecology. And when we think about scale in ecology, this will really structure the sort of the nature of the course, the way the course is taught through the term. We sort of start at a fairly small scale of the individual and move up to the very large scale of the landscape or the planet. Okay. So, ecology. Why should we care? Why is this topic important to us? Well, this is our world. Our world is a pretty amazing place with incredible biodiversity, tremendous diversity of ecosystems, from these lovely lush rainforests to coastal areas to coral reefs full of diversity. And understanding this biodiversity and the functions that different components of biodiversity serve and how those benefit us as a society are all really important things. And then thinking at the same time, well, how are we as humans impacting these different aspects of these amazing ecosystems? And the first challenge is that we as a species are incredibly successful. This is human population growth since the 1800s. And so these are data from the UN World Population Prospects report published in 2019. And you can see that for the last couple hundred years, starting in 1800, population was increased gradually, but was pretty stable. And then starting around the 1950s, 1960s, we started to have this really rapid exponential growth. And we're now, as of 2020, there were 7.8 billion people. And then we have these wildly ranging projections from a high of 15.6 billion people to a low of 7.3 billion people if reproductive rates decline and we stabilize the population at around the level it is right now. And so given our lifestyles, given our resource needs, we occupy a huge amount of the planet and have modified a huge amount of the planet and are having really rapid and damaging consequences for planetary health and for all of the other species that occupy the planet. So the first of these, and these are some of the big themes we'll be sort of threading throughout the course, the first of these is really rapid atmospheric change. This is a graph, this is taken from your text, this is a graph of, where the red line is carbon dioxide concentrations, the orange line is nitrous oxide concentrations, and the blue line is methane. All of these are greenhouse gases, and we'll be talking about those at various points throughout the term, but as you're familiar, greenhouse gases are those gases that when they're in the atmosphere, they help to trap heat, they help to trap energy at the Earth's surface. And so the more of these gases we have in the atmosphere, the warmer the planet is. And this is exactly what we're seeing now with rapid climate warming that we're seeing on the planet. So the way you read this graph is on this axis. These are kind of complicated graphs because we have two y-axes. So first of all, on the x-axis is year, and so it starts at 0, goes to 2000, so this is about present day. On the y-axis we have both carbon dioxide concentrations in parts per million and nitrous oxide concentrations in parts per billion. And so you read that depending on the color of the line. So red being carbon dioxide, orange being nitrous oxide. And then methane is over here on the second y-axis in parts per billion. Okay? So, doesn't really matter which line you look at, we're seeing the same trends across the board. The concentrations of those greenhouse gases were very constant until we started to industrialize the planet, at which point we've seen this exponential increase in the concentrations of all three of these greenhouse gases. And so this is one aspect of the way in which we as humans have changed the planet. And this rapid atmospheric change is driving rapid climate change. And so this again this is temperatures starting in 1870 going up to present day, and you can see that, this is the temperature anomaly, not the temperature. So 0, an anomaly of 0 would be that the temperature that year was exactly the long-term average. So when we think about temperatures, we think, and precipitation and different climate variables, we think about normals. These are the average temperature or the average precipitation over a long time period. And if the climate is stable, then those averages represent the climate in that area, in this case, the climate on the planet. If the climate is not stable, then all of a sudden you start to have anomalies that are higher than or lower than this normal value, which is the dashed line of 0. And so we can see that we had kind of a cool period here in the late 1800s, early 1900s. But since about 1970, again, this corresponds with the increase in greenhouse gases in the atmosphere, the increase in concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. We see a consistent upward trend with, 2019, 2018 being almost a degree warmer than the long-term average. Okay, and some parts of the planet have warmed much more than that. Places that I work in the Arctic have warmed, average temperatures have warmed 3 to 4 degrees over these long-term normals. Winter temperatures have increased as much as 10 degrees. Okay, so these changes are really rapid, and you can see that the differences in observed change in surface temperature, it's not the same across the whole planet. So in this graph, blue places are places that have cooled. The warm colors, the oranges, and then getting into the purples, those are places that have warmed. And you can see that almost the entire planet has warmed, but certain places, including the Arctic regions and parts of South America and Africa, have warmed much more than the rest of the planet. And so there's differential warming across the planet. And then we're also seeing, as part of this sort of as part of climate change, we're also seeing changes in precipitation. And in this case, we see brown values being decreases in precipitation, blue values being increases in precipitation. And again, this is not consistent. Dry places seem to be getting drier. There's lots of places that are getting wetter, but then, for example, the wheat belt, parts of Saskatchewan, Alberta, for example, those are getting drier. Much of Africa is getting drier. So we see these changes, these systematic changes on the planet that are directly linked to human activities and are having pretty widespread consequences for a whole range of processes. We'll get into that as we go through the course. Second really important change that humans have made on the planet is land cover change. And so this is, if you think about sort of the Earth, before any kind of development happened, you could imagine an area that was just covered in forest. And this is much more common typical of what we see today, where the landscape, parts of this contiguous forest cover have been removed, used for other purposes, and through time, this tends to be the pattern that you go from this contiguous land cover to a fragmented land cover where you still have fairly large patches of habitat in the landscape, but you've altered the land cover to something else. And this continues to decline as demand for the new use in that land increases. And so these land cover changes have really important implications for a number of processes. In our lecture next week, we'll talk about how land cover change alters absorption of energy and sort of the cooling and heating of the Earth's surface. This is a really important factor in that energy exchange to the atmosphere. But also when we think about other species on the planet, as we remove intact habitat and transition it to some other use, we're losing biodiversity directly by removing those vegetation communities, but we're also impacting biodiversity through habitat loss. So many species are being lost because of changes to habitat availability, and this, you can see that in this figure. So the top panel is species lost due to habitat loss. This one is species lost due to overexploitation, so that's harvesting. And this one is species lost due to accidental mortality, and this one is due to pollution. And you can see that, so for particularly in the terrestrial environment, land cover change, and that's not surprising that it's not an impact in the marine environment, but in the terrestrial environment, land cover change is really a massive driver of species loss. In the marine environment, we can see that it tends to be issues related to accidental mortality, so things like bycatch, and through pollution. So these are, we can think of pollution as kind of an equivalent to, I guess, land cover change, water pollution as kind of an equivalent to land cover change for these marine species, because it's altering their physical environment, altering their habitat quality. Okay, so we have these changes caused by humans that are driving alterations to the atmosphere, driving alterations to the climate system, and that has huge implications for the way the planet functions. We're altering land cover through our own needs and uses of the land, which has implications for a wide range of other species across the planet. So there are many, many kind of what we might refer to as wicked societal problems that are really closely and inherently linked with ecology. And understanding the ecology of these systems helps us understand and predict or project what, how these systems may function given these additional pressures that humans are placing on these ecosystems. And so it also helps us understand what we're losing. If we alter the functioning of a particular ecosystem, what does that mean for our own well-being, the well-being of other species, etc.? And so these are topics we'll talk about throughout the course. Okay, so what is ecology then? We're talking about, this is the topic of the course. What exactly do we mean by ecology? Well, first of all, many people think that ecology, environmentalism, and environmental science are all kind of interchangeable terms, and I just want to sort of debunk that myth. Ecology is a branch of biology. It is a scientific discipline. It is a branch of biology. We use quantitative tools. We use the scientific method, which we'll get into. And in contrast, environmental science is a highly interdisciplinary field. It often involves a combination of natural and social and health sciences, because we're talking about sort of environmental issues more broadly, and so there are a lot of social and health components to those problems. Ecology is certainly part of environmental science. It contributes to this natural science piece, but on its own it is really just strictly a natural science. And environmentalism is concerned about action, is concerned about an action aimed at protecting the environment. So this is really advocacy for, reducing harm to the environment. And so you can see that these are, very different things. There are lots of connections, but the differences are important to recognize, and they often get conflated in, the general public eye, in the media, etc. So just some definitions, a couple of definitions for you, just so you have it clear in your own heads what ecology is. So first, this is from our text: the scientific study of interactions between organisms and their environment. So we have biological entities, we have the physical environment. How are those organisms interacting with their environment, interacting with one another, and that occurs across scales, as we'll see moving through this lecture. And this is from the Oxford Dictionary: the branch of biology that deals with the relations of organisms to one another and their physical surroundings. So again, same kinds of ideas. So a scientific discipline in which we study organisms, their interactions with one another, and their interactions with the environment. Okay, so now that we have a definition of ecology, I wanted to spend just a few minutes talking about multiple ways of knowing in ecology. And before I do that, I just want to acknowledge that I am not Indigenous. I am a white Canadian, and everything that I say over the next few slides is really my understanding of the differences and similarities between traditional ecological knowledge and Western ecological knowledge. But we are really lucky to be joined this term by two Indigenous scholars, Dr. Jessie Popp and Lawrence Ignace. Dr. Popp is going to be joining us this week to share some of her research on weaving traditional ecological knowledge and Western ecological research. Dr. Popp is a chair in Indigenous Environmental Science and an assistant professor at University of Guelph, and a member of the Wikwemkong unceded territory. At the very end of the term, Lawrence Ignace, who's a PhD student at the University of Victoria and a member of the Lac des Mille Lacs First Nations, is going to join us to talk about a really important paper that he was a co-author on that outlines 10 steps to decolonizing the natural sciences. And so over the next few slides, I'm going to be sharing with you some similarities and differences between these multiple ways of knowing, just so you have a handle on, what is traditional ecological knowledge? How does it relate to ecology, so that we're prepared for these speakers that we're going to be hearing from during the term. Okay, so the definition of traditional ecological knowledge that comes from the Assembly of First Nations is, although there's no universally accepted definition of traditional knowledge, this term is commonly understood to refer to the collective knowledge of traditions used by Indigenous groups to sustain and adapt themselves to their environment over time. This information is passed on from one generation to the next within the Indigenous group. Okay. So when we see that definition, there's lots of similarities with the kinds of ideas that we think about in ecology, thinking about a relationship of a relationship to the environment, to different components of the environment, and how that environment is changing through time. Okay, so just to sort of do a little bit of a comparison between traditional ecological knowledge and Western ecology, when we think about Western ecology, it has an overarching goal of generalization. So we want to take knowledge that we gain from a particular system and be able to extrapolate that to larger spatial domains or larger temporal domains. In contrast, traditional knowledge holders, traditional ecological knowledge tends to be much more place-based. These folks, these traditional knowledge holders, are really focused on the lands that they are working and living and harvesting on, and that is where the focus is with traditional ecological knowledge. And just to kind of exemplify that, when I run a fairly large fire ecology research program in the Northwest Territories, and the way we designed our sampling was to sample across as many different environmental conditions, as large of a spatial extent as we possibly could, so that we would have information from large areas of the same kinds of measurements that we could then extrapolate to much larger areas and hopefully use to project changes through time in response to severe wildfire. In contrast, when I'm working with community partners, the real interest of these folks is to understand, okay, well, show us the data that came from our lands and look at how this relates to local understanding of the changes that happened after fire. So these are really two different approaches and or two different ways of thinking about ecology. But both are verified through repeated observations. So we go out on the land, we measure various things, or we observe various things, whether as a Western scientist or as a traditional knowledge holder. And this is how we learn about the environment. Okay, so in Western ecology, we formalize hypotheses. We use the scientific method. We state these hypotheses, we come up with predictions, and we go through this formal scientific method process that I'm going to be talking about in a little bit. Traditional ecological knowledge, because of this shared attribute of both of these systems using inference and prediction, certainly hypotheses are developed in traditional ecological knowledge, but they're not formalized the way we would in Western science. And so the approach is less structured, but a lot of the same kinds of thought processes are at play. In ecology, ecologists take a very reductionist, hierarchical approach. We really like to categorize things and think about them in a very structured way. You'll see that when I go through some information on biological organization in the next few slides. In contrast, traditional ecological knowledge tends to take a more holistic, conceptual approach, thinking about the system as an entity as opposed to trying to break it down into its various components. Now again, both of these knowledge systems use observations to recognize patterns and to understand processes that are happening within the system. And the last comparison I want to make simply has to do with how these different knowledge systems are documented. So scientists tend to record their research in written forms. And in contrast, traditional ecological knowledge tends to be shared using oral methods, so verbal communication of ideas, of knowledge, of experience. And as a consequence, because of this aspect of verbal communication, the time frames over which traditional ecological knowledge has been documented are much longer than that of the scientific record. And so there's an incredible amount of knowledge and information that can extend back through time in ways that we cannot in the recorded record of science, and that can really complement scientific studies of processes because of this much longer time frame over which information has been collected and synthesized through traditional ecological knowledge approaches. Okay, so just to give a little example, and please do take a look at this little video clip that I've popped in here. It's a video of some Indigenous knowledge holders in Australia talking about firehawks and meeting with this researcher who was studying firehawks from a scientific perspective. And this is a really interesting example. These firehawks, so it's a hawk species in Australia that there's been some recent media about in relation to the Australian bushfires, because what these hawks do is they when there's a fire happening, they'll actively go collect a burning stick, some burning material, and deposit it in an area that does not have any fire. The reason they're doing this is to flush out prey species, which are then very easy to catch as they're fleeing their now burning habitat. This behavior, this really unusual behavior, unusual to the animal kingdom, was documented by scientists, and this was a new discovery to science. But when those scientists talked to traditional knowledge holders in Australia, they realized, oh gosh, this is well known information in these Indigenous communities that these hawks spread fire around the landscape. And so one of the papers that came out of this actually used this Indigenous knowledge to verify the scientific data that was being collected and to demonstrate that this had been happening through time. So firehawks, new to science but not to traditional ecological knowledge. And so I just really want to exemplify or reiterate the value in multiple ways of knowing. This is really a path to discovery. This is a quote from the paper that I shared with you. Whether or not traditional knowledge systems and scientific reasoning are mutually supportive, even contradictory lines of evidence have value. Employing TK-based observations and explanations within multiple working hypotheses ensures consideration of a variety of predictive, interpretive, or explanatory possibilities not constrained by Western expectation or logic. And hypotheses incorporating traditional knowledge-based information can lead the way to unanticipated insights. So, as you develop as scientists, as you start to conduct your own research, if that is the direction you go on, keep your mind open to these multiple ways of knowing. Acknowledge the value in these knowledge systems and bringing these knowledge systems together. And there's lots of opportunity for wonderful collaborations and exciting advances in science. In ecology, I should say. Okay, so as I mentioned, we have our first visiting scientist lecture, and I have a related reading here. So as I mentioned earlier, Dr. Pop will not be able to join us synchronously because of ongoing challenges with this cursed pandemic. But she has kindly shared a YouTube video of a lecture that contains content that is really relevant to what we've been talking about over the last few slides. And so I would ask that you watch that as part of our required lecture material. You only need to watch up to minute 38. After this, it's a question and answer session from the seminar she was giving, and you're welcome to listen to those questions and answers, of course, but you don't need to. And the second piece is this this paper from the conversation, and it has the Firehawk information as well as many other examples where traditional ecological knowledge and Western science have come together very effectively. So the paper is referred to, is entitled, "It's Taken Thousands of Years, but Western Science is Finally Catching Up to Traditional Knowledge." Okay, so again, as I mentioned, this is a bit of a hodgepodge of a lecture, but some key things I wanted to cover off on before we head into the chapters in the textbook. So, the scientific method. We already touched on this earlier in the course. It's really a central part of ecology. It's one of the things that really defines Western ecological science compared to traditional ecological knowledge, as we just talked about. So, what do scientists do? Is there a method for doing good science? What distinguishes the scientific perspective from other ways of knowing the world? And so this is what we'll cover off on a little bit in this section. We've already touched on this, but getting into the scientific method, this is really a review. You will have covered off on the scientific method in the introductory biology classes you've taken. But just to get your head back into that, the steps to the scientific method is first defining a question. First of all, that question has to be able to be answered. There are some questions that simply can't be answered. Second, your question should push the boundaries of knowledge, so it needs to be something that adds value or adds to a growing body of knowledge about a particular topic. If that is not pushing the boundaries, if you're just kind of repeating work that someone else has done, if you have not done sufficient work to look into what is novel and what is not, then the contribution will be very limited. And finally, a question that is interesting and useful. So, of course, no one wants to be asking questions that don't have some value to the science, to society, etc. And so making sure that there is that value to the question that you're asking. So, just to get into an example, we have our beautiful monarch butterfly here and its larva. So, why are monarch populations declining? When we think about this question, if we go back to our previous slide, it's a question that can be answered. It's a big problem, it's a big challenge, but it's a question that can be answered. Certainly some parts of this have been addressed, but there are still outstanding issues. So there are questions under this broader scope that really still require addressing, and it's really interesting and valuable. Even if your only interest is maintenance of biodiversity and the joy that you get from seeing monarch butterflies in your backyard in the summer, there's value to this. So, going back to this, can this question be answered? Is it possible to collect evidence? And the answer to that is yes. Do we already know the answer? So what you need to do to get down to whether we already know the answer or not is to figure out what we know and what we don't know. So this is a literature review. So if you're really concerned about monarchs, there's going to be some things that have been answered already. There's going to be some outstanding questions that still need a lot of work. And so what we do as scientists is we undertake a review of the scientific literature to be able to understand what we know and what we don't know. And then finally, why should we care? Why is it important to understand what is happening and why it's happening to monarch butterflies. You know, in many cases, again, it's maybe just that people really value this species. In other cases, the loss of one species can indicate a larger underlying problem that really needs to be addressed. So there we go. There's our question. So our question is, why are monarchs declining? And so then we need to use our knowledge of the system to develop a hypothesis. And you already know this, but a hypothesis is a possible answer to a question developed using previous knowledge or intuition. Okay, so we know something about the system already. We can develop some hypotheses about what might be driving decline in monarch populations. And so a couple of examples of hypotheses are, one, that neonicotinoid insecticides cause monarch decline. Neonicotinoid insecticides are insecticides that are applied very broadly to deal with certain insect pests. We know that they negatively impact non-target, non-pest species as well. As an example, lots of bee populations are declining because of neonicotinoid use. So reasonable hypothesis would be that maybe monarchs are also being negatively impacted. A second alternate hypothesis is that glyphosate, you'd probably know this as Roundup, it's a herbicide that's widely used to kill weeds, particularly in agricultural settings, but people use it on their lawns as well, so to get rid of dandelions and other weeds that they don't particularly want. But glyphosate herbicides cause monarch decline, and we'll get into why that may be the case in the next slide. So it's also worth noting that there are many other hypotheses for monarch declines, and as you go through the scientific method and test these different hypotheses, if you refute hypothesis 1 and hypothesis 2, you may need to, as part of your method, move along to other hypotheses for this decline. Okay, but where do hypotheses come from? So the main thing is observations. Okay, so we use induction or inductive reasoning to develop hypotheses. And so basically, it's a type of reasoning that involves drawing a general conclusion from a set of specific observations. So we go from specific cases to a broader general conclusion. So we infer the potential for a general statement about how something in nature works. So we've made some observations. We say, okay, based on these observations, we think this is happening, and so we're going to broadly hypothesize that this is happening more broadly. Okay, so our background knowledge in this situation is that monarchs need a plant species called milkweed for reproduction. We have that knowledge of the system. We've spent time working in the system. We know that monarchs lay their larvae on milkweed, and those larvae consume the milkweed, in fact incorporate toxins from the milkweed into their bodies to help reduce predation. And then specific observation, glyphosate, so Roundup, is widely used and clears milkweed out from some agricultural areas. Okay, so we know that monarchs use milkweed for their young, and we know that glyphosate can damage milkweed and remove it from some agricultural areas. So then, going from this specific observation to something more general, if Roundup removes enough milkweed, then monarch reproduction will fail. So we go from this narrow observation to a broader generalization. We've used inductive reasoning. Okay, so our steps, we've got our question. We've got our hypotheses. In this case, we only showed 2 hypotheses. But then, to test hypotheses, we need predictions. So we have sets of predictions that go along with each hypothesis. In order for that hypothesis to be supported, we need to be able to show that prediction A and prediction B are correct. Okay, so for a hypothesis to be testable, it must make predictions that can potentially be falsified. So here's a couple of examples of predictions. One of these is falsifiable, one is not. So species A lives everywhere except places to which it hasn't dispersed and or does not survive. Well, that statement by its nature is true. And so you can't falsify it. Of course, a species only lives in places where it hasn't dispersed and or it hasn't died. So that is not a good prediction because you cannot falsify that. In contrast, our second prediction is that species A inhabits areas in which it can tolerate environmental conditions. That is something we can test. We can go and we can measure the distribution of species A, we can measure the environmental conditions where it occurs, we can measure the environmental conditions where it doesn't occur, we can do physiological studies on individuals to evaluate their tolerance to different environmental conditions. This is something we can falsify, or that we can show is true. So this is a good prediction. This is not a good prediction. And so you have to be really careful when you frame your predictions associated with hypotheses. Okay, so distinguishing between hypotheses also requires that mutually exclusive predictions exist. If you have a hypothesis, if you have two hypotheses and they have identical predictions, then they're the same hypothesis, even if you've worded them differently. And so really being very clear about those predictions and ensuring that they are mutually exclusive predictions is critical. And predictions are derived through deductive reasoning from a hypothesis. So you've got this overarching hypothesis and you develop more specific predictions based on that overarching general hypothesis. Okay, so just to sum this up, applying the scientific method in ecology, we spend a lot of time out there in the world observing nature, observing what is happening. So we observe nature, ask well-framed questions about these observations. Then we use this previous knowledge to develop hypotheses, and from these hypotheses to deduce predictions. Third, we evaluate these. So we go out and we collect information. We go out and collect data, we perform experiments, we collect observational data, we test those predictions. And depending on what the results of those are, we may support our predictions. We may say, okay, that prediction was correct, that supports our hypothesis, or maybe that prediction was falsified, and that refutes our hypothesis. And so as we move through this scientific process, we use the results of these experiments, observations, or in some cases models, to modify our hypotheses or pose new questions. And so this is how we move the scientific discipline of ecology, or any scientific discipline, forward, is through this process of the scientific method. Now, it is important to recognize that science is not infallible. Okay, so there are lots of hypotheses that are developed that are proven to be incorrect, but the scientific method allows science to be self-correcting. When we realize we're on the wrong track, then we correct that and we move on to a different track, or we change that course a little bit. There are lots of things that make science a really excellent way of knowing certain kinds of things. So if you are using the scientific method successfully, you will be able to support successful prediction. This is really important. Increasingly knowing how a system is going to respond, how a species is going to respond, is really important given how rapidly things are changing. So successful prediction is really critical. But also this ability to predict additional characteristics. So rather than being very focused in one specific area on one specific thing, many scientists attempt, the way our scientific questions are set up is to be able to create broader generalities. And indeed, as we saw in our comparison of Western and traditional ecological knowledge systems, that's really one of the goals, is to be able to move from, the small to the large in terms of our inference about the way a system works and our ability to generalize. And reproducibility. So this reproducibility allows us to create results that are reliable and that are robust and that really support these two things really importantly, because if we create science that's not reproducible, then then neither 1 nor 2 in this list can be trusted either. So 1 and 2 give us an understanding of nature, an understanding and a projection, an understanding of nature and a projection of how things are going to work. And number 3 is our component of reliability. So here's another piece from the conversation that I'd encourage you to read. What exactly is the scientific method, and why do so many people get it wrong? So this has some really neat ideas about the ways in which the scientific method can go off the rails, and is a useful read. Okay, so the last little section I want to cover off on today relates to scale in ecology. So first of all, what is scale? So ecological scale is the size or extent of the landscape under consideration. So when you think about scale in ecology, and the scale of the study is dictated by the questions and the study organisms. So if we take a look at this diagram, we have on the one hand a tiny little snail. In the second, we have a toad or a frog. And in the third, we have this egret, this large mobile organism. So when we think about the scale, if you think about the kind of study that you might develop to study a snail versus a frog versus an egret, they're really very, very different. On the one hand, the snail, it's not very mobile, it can't move very far, and so really all you maybe need is a little patch of meadow in which that snail occupies, or that a population of that snail species inhabits. Okay, so that scale is very small, and you may be, you're probably working on the order of, square meter plots, for example, within this meadow area. In contrast, if you're interested in a frog, and what that frog or what that population of frogs are doing, you need to incorporate the different habitats that frog uses. So many frogs use forests for one part of their life cycle and ponds for another part of their life cycle. Of course, they lay their young in the ponds. Those young develop there, and then the frogs may spend more of their adult time in these forested areas. So you need to increase. So here's this same, probably the same shrub right there, or maybe it's this one. So you can see we've gone from one little patch of meadow up to a larger scale where we've got a couple of ponds, many of these shrubs, and a larger patch of meadow, and the adjacent forested area. And that's the scale that we need to understand this more mobile organism that moves from one habitat to another. And now finally we've got this egret. This egret can move and fly and uses a much larger area of the landscape to hunt and to nest and to carry out all of the various aspects of its life that it needs. And so the scale that we have to think about for this egret is much different than that of the frog, and much, much different than that of the snail. And so scale is really important to consider, both at the spatial scale like we see here, but also the temporal scale. Okay, so not only does the spatial scale matter when we're thinking about the relevant scale for a particular ecological study, but the temporal scale matters as well. So here we have a diagram showing information from, or scales from local all the way up to global scales, so from the small to the large scale, spatial scale, and then from the short term to the long term, so short to long temporal scales. And this combination, you can think about different spatial scales in terms of the temporal scale that you might study them across, and the types of studies that are relevant for those temporal and spatial scales. And so if you're thinking about forest environments like I do, at the leaf, crown, or patch scale, you're really thinking about local and maybe verging up to regional studies that happen over fairly short time frames. We're talking about responses of individuals or small patches of forest to whatever the change of interest is. And these studies may be conducted using experiments, or observations, or or in some cases models. So any of those study types can work at this particular scale, at these small temporal and spatial scales. When you start to move up in spatial scale, so when you start to get to the regional or global scale, so entire forests, landscapes, so forests and other habitats, other land cover types within them, an entire biome, let's use the boreal as an example, or the biosphere, these scales are very large. They're from the regional to global scales. And the studies that we conduct on them are in the very long term, because the processes that influence these scales happen over long time frames. Okay? And in that case, so the experiments that we might have carried out at these small scales no longer really work at these large scales, because you can't actually replicate the experiment. The feasibility of doing an experiment on that kind of spatial scale is not something you can consider. So the types of studies we use at these larger scales and longer time frames are observations and models. Okay, so when we think about the type of ecological study we may want to carry out, it's really important to consider both these spatial and temporal scales. Okay, and then just to get into these details that really serve the structure of the course. So moving from the individual right up to the biome. So here we have some lovely images of raccoon fish. So an individual of that particular species. That individual is part of a population, so multiple individuals of the same species interacting with one another. That population of raccoon fish is part of a number of species that interact with one another to form a community. And then if you consider all of those species in the context of their physical environment, then we all of a sudden have an ecosystem. Those communities and ecosystem they're all nested within a landscape. And that landscape has many different types of habitats, species that do not interact with one another directly, many different land cover types, and the next step up from a landscape is a biome, all of the sort of shared climatically and biotically similar regions. And then finally, the biosphere, which includes all of the Earth's ecosystems, landscapes, biomes. So the course will really be structured like that. We'll be going from the small scale up to the large scale and thinking about the processes that are important at those different scales. So I'm not going to go through these, but I do expect you to learn them. These are definitions of all of those different nested biological terms that we just went through. And this is a great example of that hierarchical structure that scientists love to use, where we categorize different things and put them into a hierarchy. Okay, and it's really important to recognize that there are interactions throughout this hierarchy. So you go from the individual is nested within a population, is nested within a community, is nested within an ecosystem. That ecosystem is nested within a landscape which isn't shown here, which is nested within this biome, which is nested within the biosphere. So this is this hierarchy that we can think about when we're thinking about biological organization. And with that, we are through this week's lecture. I'm looking forward to seeing you all on Thursday and to talking with you next week about the physical environment. All right, have a great day.